مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. بعد فترة من الهدوء النسبي في الشرق الأوسط، بدأت حرب حماس وإسرائيل تتصدر أجندة إدارة الرئيس بايدن في أكتوبر الماضي، واحتلت مركز صدارة الأحداث منذ ذلك الحين. ومع أن هذه الحرب سببت أوقاتا صعبة ومضطربة، إلا أن البيت الأبيض تمكن من الإشارة إلى نصر رئيسي منذ البداية، وهو النجاح في احتواء الحرب في غزة ومنعها من التصعيد التحول إلى حرب إقليمية بين إسرائيل من جهة وإيران وخلفائها ووكالائها في المنطقة من جهة أخرى. وفي بداية أبريل الحالي كان هذا النجاح أن ينهار، وذلك عندما أطلقت إيران مئات الطائرات المسيرة والصواريخ على الدولة اليهودية للترد على غارة إسرائيلية استهدفت مبنى في دمشق، وهو أول هجوم من دولة على دولة ضد إسرائيل من قبل الجمهورية الإسلامية. وأصبح احتمال الحرب الإقليمية ممكنا، إلا أن الحرب لم تقع وبدأ مؤشر الخوف بالتراجع. كيف اقتربت الحرب الإقليمية وكيف استطعنا تجنبها؟ لبحث هذه التساؤلات الخطيرة يسرني أن أستضيف خبير في الشؤون الخارجية وان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. We have just witnessed a fascinating episode in American Middle East policy and in Middle East politics writ large, a near war between Israel and Iran, two countries that have been at loggerheads for decades. Let's take a close look at what happened and how open warfare was averted. I'm delighted to welcome Juan Zarate with us on this show. Juan, now, you know from your own experience, Israel and Iran have been fighting a gray war for 40 years. What has that looked like over the decades?
Well, Rob, there's been a proxy battle underway, certainly from the Iranian side, post the 1979 revolution, where the Iranians have over time established beachfronts surrounding Israel through the use of organizations and proxies in various places, Hezbollah in Lebanon being the most important and signature and mature of those proxies, but certainly with support to Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, other Palestinian rejectionist groups over time, building up their capabilities. And then in recent years, greater and greater support to the Houthi rebels in Yemen. What the Iranians have, in essence, done is to create proxy forces led by the Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force, including most recently in Syria, that has allowed them to, in essence, encircle Israel with these proxy forces and further capacitate them, fund them, provide them with training and missiles and other capabilities. And what you've had, obviously, is that proxy war underway with the Israelis trying to diminish that capacity over time with strikes in Lebanon, strikes in Syria. Obviously, in the wake of October 7th, the invasion of Gaza and the attack on Hamas infrastructure, all intended to weaken those proxies. But as you said, that proxy war has now come out into the open, and with the firing of missiles and drones from Iran directly into Israeli airspace and territory, and the Israeli response back with its attack into Isfahan, that proxy war has now come into the open and very much has raised the risk of a broader, more open, more violent escalation.
All right. So before we get to the back and forth of recent days, this proxy war that you referred to that's been going on for many years Iranians having their local allies shoot at Israel or attack this or that Israeli consulate or embassy or site, and Israelis in the shadows working against Iran in different countries and sometimes assassinating this or that Iranian official or scientist. This has been going on, but there was always one clear line that they didn't cross. What was that?
Well, the line that they didn't cross was direct confrontation and putting at risk not only the countries, but also the sovereignty of the nations. That is to say, though you could have conflict in these other arenas or through other actors or through covert means, the direct confrontation between the national forces, be they aircraft or missiles or drones, was a definitive red line, or at least was a red line that was being respected over time. And what you had then was the rupture of that red line, the direct attack on Israeli territory directly from Iran, and then the attack from Israel back into Iran. And so we crossed that Rubicon, which had not been crossed before, even though many would say you had a pretty violent proxy battle underway in various ways in various parts of the world. And it was no secret that Iran was behind much of it. And obviously Israel was responding. I think the advantage that both countries had in the days before that line was crossed, in the days of the proxy or shadow wars, was that they had the ability to deny, to obfuscate or to confuse attribution. Who was really behind attacks? How much was Iran directing these attacks? You have seen this debate even in the wake of October 7th, where there were questions as to how much Iran directed, controlled, or even knew about the October 7th attack. And many on the other side saying, of course Iran knew, of course Iran capacitated and enabled Hamas, and of course they wanted this kind of action to attack and disable and disorient the Israeli state. But that was all in some ways deniable and had elements of, even in the cyber domain, the ability to hide their hand and to confuse attribution. Once the countries start using national assets to attack each other's territory and sovereignty directly, that deniability, that attribution is all changed, and it's now very clear that there is direct confrontation.
So let's bring in one other key actor in all this, the United States. Now, there's lots of difference between President Obama, President Trump, President Biden, but one thing they all shared was an aversion to getting directly involved in a military confrontation with Iran. Why?
Well, I think the concern in the United States, certainly in the wake of the Iraq War and the withdrawal there, and certainly the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, has been to avoid further involvement in any conflicts in the Middle East, certainly not to involve further American blood or treasure in any conflicts, and certainly not with Iran, where that conflict would be seen as a major war, major conflict, would create risks in the region for destabilization, certainly would commit the United States in ways that the American public seems not willing to engage in, certainly not the politicians. And so there hasn't been a desire to further commit to potential conflict in the Middle East. At the same time, in the wake of Israel being attacked on October 7th and having to respond, there's a deep desire to support Israel, to defend Israel, for allies and enemies alike to know that the United States backs its strongest and most important ally in the Middle East. And so that is why you've seen the U.S. providing arms, intelligence, even defense during the Iranian attack from the U.S. directly. Though, as you say, the instinct in the United States is to avoid direct involvement. You've seen this not just in the Middle East, but in Ukraine as well, and to avoid escalation. to a point where I think critics like myself would say that the instinct for de-escalation is actually empowering to those that are willing to push the envelope and cross red lines, like the Iranians. And so the immediate instinct for the United States was for Israel to take the win in the Biden parlance, to not respond, to not escalate, to not get dragged into a direct war, to allow Iran to continue to make mistakes, to take the ability of Iranian multi-layered defenses as to defend the territory as a success. But that instinct for de-escalation, for not getting entangled in another war in the Middle East, and certainly not to get dragged in inadvertently based on flashpoints, is at the heart of much of what you see from the United States in terms of what it says and what it's urging of Israel.
So just to build on that, another word of context before we really dive into what happened the last couple of weeks. We had, in some sense, a preview of all this twice before, with Iranian attacks, Iranian-inspired and direct attacks against Saudi Arabia in 2019 and against the United Arab Emirates in 2021, two of America's strongest Arab partners. How did the U.S. respond in those occasions, and how might Iran have assumed, therefore, the U.S. would respond in this occasion?
Yeah, Rob, you're asking a critical question, because I think the debate and certainly the criticism is that deterrence has eroded over time precisely because the United States has not been more forceful, more maybe even open about countering Iranian aggression and adventurism, either directly or indirectly through proxies, to the point where not only those instances that you've mentioned, other attacks, for example, Hezbollah plots in Europe, the Bulgarian attack, and then most recently the attack on even an American base in Jordan, resulting in the killing of 3 American soldiers, which resulted in an American response, but not an American response directly to Iran, but at the proxy forces that had launched the attack. And so the criticism has been that the U.S. has not done more forcefully to not only attack the proxies, but also to maybe diminish the capability of Iran to continue to support those proxies, and certainly has not done enough, in my opinion, Rob, to signal to Iran that they would be held to account for anything that the proxies have done. I think the United States has shown a bit of weakness in all of those episodes by not being clear that regardless of whether or not the Revolutionary Guard was directly behind an attack, that the United States and its allies would hold Iran accountable for anything that their proxies were doing to affect U.S. and allied interests. And certainly if they were going to kill American service people, Iran would be held directly accountable. The U.S. has sort of been willing to play the game of deniability to avoid escalation. But I think in so doing, it has created the very conditions for escalation, allowing Iran to further its adventurism and its attacks via proxies, and now even directly.
So that's the context to what has occurred the last few weeks. Now, just to remind our viewers, so the Israelis, as part of this gray war, had an operation in Damascus, took out a handful of senior Revolutionary Guard officers, not something totally dissimilar to what they've, the sorts of operations that we've seen over the years. But this time, the Iranians reacted differently. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, you're right. I think the Israeli attack in the minds of the Israelis was very much of the type that they've engaged in before. They in essence killed the IRGC commander in the region, whom they hold accountable for October 7th, or at least claim that he played a role in. So in the Israeli mindset, this was an appropriate countermeasure reaction to October 7th holding those to account, and also taking preventative measures to not allow Iran to further plan with its allies in Syria, and then with others, putting at risk Golan and other things. So you're right that the Israelis, I think, very much saw this as part and parcel of their reaction to October 7th, and of weeding the garden of threats and risks from the IRGC and their proxies in the region. The fact that it was a strike on a diplomatic compound, I think, may have been something that was both seen and used as an excuse by the Iranians to then respond. First of all, they didn't like the fact that several senior commanders were taken out. Secondly, they saw it perhaps as an overstep in terms of strikes in Damascus, which Israel has undertaken before, of course. And they also saw it then as an attack on their diplomatic, property and sovereignty in technical terms. So, in some ways, I think Iran used it as an excuse then to respond, and in many ways may have seen that they had to respond because it was such a direct assault on their sovereignty in that regard. But at the end of the day, I think what you've seen is an escalation of the confrontation. In many ways, I think this was inevitable to the extent that Israel continued to respond to proxy provocations, and Iran continued to direct and support and arm those proxies. It's inevitable that the confrontation would come, and I think that's what was revealed in the most recent episode.
All right, so now we've set it up for to describe exactly what happened on April 13th when the Iranians attacked and Israel and its allies responded. We're going to talk about that just after the break. Back with Juan Zarate in just a moment. My guest today is Juan Zarate. Juan is one of America's leading counterterrorism experts. He served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism in the George W. Bush White House. And he was twice appointed by Pope Francis to sit on the board of the Vatican's Financial Information Authority. He is the author of Treasury's War and Forging Democracy. Juan is the global co-managing partner and chief strategy officer for the consulting firm K2 Integrity, and he is founder and chair of the board of Consilient, an innovative fintech startup. All right, Juan, let's take a look at April 13th. First, the Iranians launched the largest cross-border attack of missiles and drones in decades. The last time a state launched this sort of volley of missiles and drones against Israel, it was a much smaller amount by Saddam Hussein in 1991. That original Saddam Hussein attack ended up doing more damage than what Iran did just a few weeks ago. What happened?
Well, Iran signaled that they were going to respond to the April 1st Israeli attack on the IRGC commanders in Damascus. Interestingly, they were very much signaling this. This was, in some ways, not a surprise attack. And what Iran ultimately did on April 13th into April 14th was to launch 300 plus drones and missiles from its territory and from other bases in the region that it controls into Israeli territory. And this was, to your point, a barrage that was of a scope and scale that was significant. If Israel had not had its multi-layered missile defense and drone defense system in place and the support of allies, there could have been very real damage. The images of missiles streaking over Jerusalem were quite stark and headed toward Tel Aviv. quite chilling, actually. But fortunately, 99% of the missiles and drones were struck down. I think what we've seen is two things. I think an attempt by Iran to send a signal that they can reach into Israel directly, and that they're willing to at this point to cross that Rubicon that we were talking about, to lift the veil behind the shadow war, so to speak. And so they were sending a very clear signal. We can hit Israel, or we can at least try. For Israel, I think it was important on a couple of fronts. One, it was able to demonstrate the effectiveness of its multi-layered defense system, its Iron Dome, its David Sling, its Arrow program, the Patriot missiles, not to mention the work of the aircraft. That was comforting, no doubt, to the Israelis and to others. And as I said earlier, the White House said you should take this as a win because the defenses work so well.
So I have to ask, we don't have that much time left. What Israel was able to do to get, even its targeted strike where it wanted it to go, how is all this connected to the big topic that we haven't discussed, namely Iran's nuclear ambitions?
Yes, I think that's the looming question that sits behind all of this conflict, as well as the posture toward Iran. Is Iran inching toward or racing toward, nuclear capabilities, military nuclear capabilities of the type that the West has said the United States would not allow? And the strike by the Israelis was intended as a message with respect to the nuclear infrastructure that Iran has. The strikes were targeted at a base in Isfahan. Of course, that's the site of an important nuclear facility and nuclear infrastructure. Many of the calls by those calling for a more aggressive response from Israel was for Israel to actually begin to strike the Iranian nuclear infrastructure, precisely because of the concerns that Iran has been getting closer and closer to enrichment capabilities, intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities that would make Iran a nuclear state and a real threat to the existence of Israel, not to mention potentially a threat to the United States. And so looming behind all of this is, can the international community actually contain Iran's march toward nuclear capabilities? Does this conflict incentivize, in many ways, Khamenei and the clerical regime to move toward nuclear weapons capability? Is the breakout time a matter of weeks, not months? We've heard that from some of the international experts that we're talking about weeks now and not months or years. And so do we have a looming nuclear crisis that sits behind this tit-for-tat battle between Israel and Iran, and behind this proxy battle that has been waged for many years now? That's the core question, and that's the grand strategic fear when it comes to Iran.
And with those foreboding questions, we're going to have to leave it. And we'll be coming back to this in the weeks ahead, because it sounds like the confrontation